everybody, Chris Lano here with IPD, and I'm out in our shop getting ready to work on our P3 chassis, which is our overland vehicle. It's our 2010 XC60. We just got these thermostat and coolant temp sensor housings in stock about a week ago. Ironically, the one on our car I believe has failed. Some of the symptoms that I run into was over the summer, I noticed that the auxiliary fan was staying on after I turned off the car way longer than I anticipated. To the point where I would have to get in the car and cycle the power button to turn it off. Also, the car's been getting really bad gas mileage. I just pulled all the check engine lights and the stored codes in the vehicle, and they were related to the thermostat, the voltage being too high on the sensor, so it's probably going open circuit or failing. And then also I've been getting rich codes, where the car's running too rich. So I'm just going to dive into it and go ahead and replace this since we got them in. One thing I wanted to let you guys know is that, in the older vehicles, the coolant temp sensor was integrated into the housing, like on the P2 chassis, where you had to replace the entire housing. On the P3 models, you can replace just the sensor by itself, which is great, but the thing is that you do have to drain all the coolant out of the car. You've got to remove the manifold. This is something that a do-it-yourselfer, I believe, can tackle themselves if they run into these types of issues. But my advice is if you're going to go ahead and replace or take everything off to get to this housing, the housing is not that bad to get to. You might as well update and replace the thermostat while you're there. But like again, I know you can get the sensor by itself, but I'm going to go ahead and tackle this whole thing and just replace all of it, because I also am a little bit concerned about the rich codes that I'm getting might be due to a failed thermostat itself. If it's wide open and it's running too much coolant through the system and too cold, then it will cause the car to run a little bit more rich. So I'm just going to go ahead and do all of it while we're here. So let's jump into this thing. Okay, so I went ahead, and the first step was to go ahead and get the lower splash pan off. You might have an aluminum skid plate on here from IPD, or you just might have the factory fabric one. But I got that off. I also undid the cap to the coolant reservoir at the top, so that way it will allow the coolant system to release down here. But the place that we're going to want to hook up to is right here on the back of the radiator. I know it can be kind of hard to see, but right here is a little tiny petcock, and it looks like it's got a little knob on it that you turn, but we're going to hook a hose up to it and then turn that knob so that way we can allow the coolant to come down into a pan. So we're going to get started on that now. Draining the coolant into a catch can. We've got the hose hooked up to the petcock there on the bottom of the radiator, which we turn counterclockwise, and it is released. We got the hose hooked up, so make it nice and clean. Once we're done draining it all up, we'll go ahead and turn that to where we close it, to where no more fluid leaks out, and then we'll go and move back up top to the engine compartment. Okay, now that we've completely drained the coolant system, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and dive into the manifold. Now there are things that you have to disconnect off the manifold. You've got basically some sensors and some emissions base pieces here, and the throttle body tube that hooks up to the bottom of the throttle body. Ultimately, we want to take off the manifold, leave the throttle body mounted to it without the hose, and just pull this up and out of the way so we can access the thermostat housing. So to begin, we're just going to go ahead and start disconnecting basically the fuel pressure sensor, some of the evap stuff here, and move some of the stuff out of the way so we can get at it, and we'll go over it one by one. In order to remove this vacuum line assembly here, we've disconnected it from the bottom of the manifold, but we have a boost gauge set up on our car right here in the middle, so it's going to be easy for us to undo one of these and remove the T-fitting there, so that way we can separate this whole line assembly from the manifold. But on your car, if you don't have a boost gauge, the easiest thing is to go ahead and open up this Oetinger right here and take this hose off of the manifold, so that way you can leave all of this in place without disconnecting anything below. So go ahead and begin by removing this Oetinger and pulling it off of the manifold itself. Okay, I just used a 7mm to loosen up the clamp on the throttle inlet tube, or the hose that goes to the throttle body itself. Right there, it was easy to get to. And then we're going to go ahead and disconnect this sensor here, pull it off there, and this one here at the fuel rail. This little clip here on the manifold can be a little tricky. So you can see here, it's just got a couple little ears that snap on over the top of this little holder that holds this wiring harness in place. So just get a screwdriver and gently pry on both sides and eventually pop it off. Push that out of the way. We're going to go ahead and remove the sensor here at the fuel rail. Okay, next we're going to go ahead and remove the fuel pressure sensor plug by pushing right here with your thumb in the middle, pulling, And then that guy comes off. Set that aside. Okay, using a 10mm, we're going to go ahead and start breaking free all of the manifold bolts. Those are all pretty accessible right there. Starting on the left side and working our way over. Okay, once you have all the bolts out of the manifold, you can rock it. It's a little bit of stiction from this to the actual head itself. But once you get this and rock it out, you're going to pull it up, and then you're going to immediately have to reach underneath here and disconnect the plug to the throttle body itself. Once you do that, everything is loose, and you can pull this complete assembly out and set it aside. Once the manifold is out of the way, you've got clear vision and sight of the actual thermostat housing and sensor. So as you can see, this thing is positioned into this orientation right here, and it looks like you got 4 Torx screws. There's one that's going to be blind, which is on the bottom right, which you're going to have to use an extension and a Torx on the end of it to go underneath it to get to it, but you'll remove all 4 of those. And then Volvo has incorporated these really cool quick disconnect like clips, like a C-clip almost, where you're gonna have to pull this up. It's got a plastic housing around the upper radiator hose that will pop off. You got the sensor there, the sensor plug, and then the only other one that's got a clamp on it is this port that leaves the thermostat housing that's aimed down here on this one, and you will have to loosen up that clamp and remove the hose from it so you can remove the entire housing. The first step is we're going to go ahead and disconnect the sensor from the actual thermostat, or the coolant temp sensor right there, and get it out of the way. And I think the best bet, honestly, is that we're going to dump coolant somewhere, whether or not we remove the upper radiator hose first, or whether or not you remove the actual thermostat housing from the block itself. So we're just going to go ahead and remove this clamp here, pull this upper radiator hose off. It's going to dump some coolant, even though you've drained it out of the bottom of the radiator. It doesn't matter. There's still some left in there. And once we get those hoses out of the way, I'm betting we're going to have better access to these Torx on the bottom, which will help us remove that portion. So let's just go ahead and get messy. And then a little quick tip. While you are working on things under the hood of your car, it's always good to plug easy access ports like holes and things like that that lead into the intercooler that could end up somewhere else that you don't want. Like when you're working with nuts and bolts, you don't want them to go into certain spaces. So it's a good idea to go ahead and just fill it with a rag, maybe cover it up with a piece of tape or something like that. But just be very careful when working around open ports while you are working underneath the hood of your car. Okay, we just shoved off the hose going to the thermostat housing, and you can see there's a little bit of coolant in the hose, but we didn't make a mess there. So I think we're in pretty good shape. If we didn't lose anything coming out there, highly doubtful we're gonna make a huge mess here. So the next one is to take off the upper radiator hose. Okay, once you pull up on this quick disconnect, like C-clip for most people that, you know, are used to things like that hold it on, you just lift it up with a screwdriver. It goes up about that far, and then you're gonna rock this thing really hard back and forth and pull away, because there is an O-ring in here, so that can get stuck, you know, on the thermostat housing. So once you pull it back, you'll feel it pop, and look at that. We don't have any coolant mess or coolant leak, so we're in good shape right now. That's great. Okay, so I used an extension and a Torx 30 for the bottom right bolt that goes on this housing. So I just went in right here with a long extension. I broke it free. You can get your hands underneath there and start spinning this thing off. You want to make sure and get it loose, and then rotate the rest of it out by hand so you don't lose it. Okay, we just got the 2 bottom Torx out using the Torx 30 and an extension. I'm going to go ahead and remove the top 2 here, one there and one there, and everything should be off of that to where we can pull that whole housing out. All right, now that everything's removed, I'm just going to give it a wiggle right here, and it should pop off. Yes. There you go. There's a thermostat.
The thermostat's broken in half.
It snapped.
And then if you look at this, the thermostat. Okay, folks, so a little surprise. Obviously, I was having issues with this thing with running a little rich. I got a code for voltage on the sensor itself. After I pulled this off of the block, it's crazy to see that the thermostat has broken in half. You can see the retainer in this new one right there, that little clip that holds the spring and the thermostat in place, is no longer in place on this one. So you might ask, where's the other portion of it? Well, it's down there inside the block. So I'm gonna have to peel that out. It's really jammed in there, which is great. So I'm gonna have to use a screwdriver or something to pry that baby out so I can get the pieces out.
destroy themselves.
So you think about the pieces, for anybody that was out there that was just looking to do the sensor, if you are combating a rich code or the car's got poor gas mileage, definitely want to take a peek at this, because it is possible that the thermostat has come apart. They're just little tiny plastic tabs that hold that spring and that collar in place, and when they break, it allows the spring to shove that assembly in there, and it got stuck. So I'm glad that we were able to take the whole housing off the block and take a peek at this. So I'm going to be pulling this out and putting the new assembly back on here in just 1 second. Okay, so we're looking at the new thermostat, and the tabs that break are those little tiny pieces of plastic where the screwdriver is touching right there. And when those break off, that allows this little retainer here on the back side of the spring to get shoved into the housing on the actual side of the engine. So, and then that way your thermostat's no longer operational. So it's a good thing that we went ahead and replaced this whole thing, and we'll get to it. All right, again, we're out in the shop, so I pardon all the noise, but here we are. It's got a new O-ring. The new housing does come with a new O-ring that's already in place around the whole outer diameter of this piece. And it's just going to go in and sit flush here, and you'll just thread in the bolts and get started. All right, now I just got the two bottom Torx in on the bottom and the top, so the housing is secured to the side of the block. Now I'm going to go ahead and connect the sensor, the hose on the right side, and the upper radiator hose last. Okay, now we've got the hose on down there and the sensor is plugged back in. What we wanted to show you is on these quick fitting hose clamps here, very commonly used in domestic vehicles, you would push this down, the clip back down, set it over the top, and as you push it on, it should click, snap. Now it's, whoops. As you push it back down, it should snap into place and click. And then pull on it, it cannot move, we're good to go. All right, everyone, now that I've got the manifold off here, a good thing to do is to replace the O-rings for the manifold. This thing does have high vacuum, and this is obviously an area where you can leak, and IPD has them in Viton, so it's for high heat. As you know, with this being bolted up to the head there, these things can shrink, they get hard, and you can get vacuum leaks. And so the best thing to do while you have this off is go ahead and use a pick tool, pull the original O-rings out, and replace them with IPD's Viton O-rings. You can actually see the thickness between the old one and the new one just from it being compressed with the manifold being put on, which it should, but over time these get really brittle and hard and they no longer make a seal, so it's good. Once you put these in on the manifold, there are thin spots in the little groove here which hold the O-ring in place, so while you're putting in the manifold they don't come out. So it might give you a little bit of trouble, but you do have to squeeze them into the thinner spots to make sure that it actually holds the O-ring in place. Okay, now that all the O-rings are in place here for the basically the manifold gaskets, the thing to do is we're going to flip this whole manifold over, and then we're going to want to make sure and remember to plug the electronic throttle module plug back in before putting the throttle body into the inlet tube here. So let's get that going. Okay, now that we have the manifold set, we made sure that the manifold is sitting properly with the throttle module in the inlet tube. We're going to tighten up that clamp there. And then we went ahead and tightened up all of these here on the manifold to hold it in place, starting with the middle, working our way out. Plugged in our sensors, and we'll make sure and button up some of the things here that we've disconnected, and then fire it up and make sure she's good to go. And don't forget to add coolant. Alright, now that we've checked the hose clamp on the throttle body, all the bolts holding on the manifold, plugged in all of our sensors, rerouted the vacuum, or made sure that the vacuum lines were all ported properly and hooked up, we went ahead and put coolant back in the rig, and we're going to fire it up and make sure that the coolant's topped off, make sure there's no air leaks, and check the codes and go from there. But that should give you guys a quick overview of what it's like to tackle the thermostat housing on these cars. It's pretty straightforward. Not too much to get you in any trouble. I think, like I said, any confident do-it-yourselfer can do this in their home or in their driveway, and you know, be able to save a little bit of money there at the independent shop and go from there. So we hope you enjoyed watching the video.